We're going to try, Josh and I have been scheming a little bit, and we're going to try something that has never been done before in the history of humankind. I'm sure it probably has. But we're both going to teach this class on Wednesday nights this quarter with the idea that what one of us can't think of, the other one can. I told Josh that as we went along that if I said something, he could say, that's a really good point. Or he could say, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. You know? So I'll leave that open to him to make those kind of observations. I'll do the same to him, all right? But what we're going to be talking about, we have a series of lessons that Bill Hall composed. Many of you know Bill Hall. We really love Bill Hall. And the title of the lessons that he composed is Major Tests of Our Faith. All right? Major tests of our faith, what we're going to be talking about. The lesson tonight, for instance, is criticism, dealing with criticism. What do you do when you face criticism? And there's a number of good topics. Just look ahead: sickness and grief, boredom and weariness, family problems. There's just a whole series of things that all of us deal with from time to time. And so that's what this series of lessons is going to be about. So this first one, and by the way, there's some study guides on the table in the back. If you don't have one already, pick one up on the way out so you can have it for next week. So I think a lot of us have faced from time to time people who criticized us, people who offered some sort of criticism. You know, you try to do what you can, you try to be active and working in the kingdom of God, and then someone criticizes you. And as Bill Hall said in his introduction, that sort of criticism often leads to discouragement. And then the tendency is to back away, to back off. You know, you've been criticized, probably unfairly, and you get discouraged about that. And so then you are tempted to back off and not be as involved or as active. So that, as he said in his introduction, this truly is a test. It's a test of our faith when this happens. Now, Josh, I think when I was thinking about this, I think there's two kinds of criticisms, and the lesson talks about that: positive and negative criticism.
Right. Yeah. So whether it's just or unjust, I think we're both going to endure criticism. And so I just jotted down a few things. You know, somebody's going to say, you're not doing that right, or somebody else could have done that. What you just did, somebody else could have done that better than you. And so maybe it's true, maybe it's not, yeah. and it affects us.
But I know when I've been criticized like that, my reaction is, well, next time you can do it.
Well, that's true.
But that's what he's saying is there's a tendency when you get this kind of unfair criticism to say, well, okay, next time somebody else will do that, not me.
Yeah, it could definitely have a negative effect, I think. And so I think that's what, as we go through the lesson, I think we're going to talk about how to deal with it in a positive way, in a good way, and then how do we deal with it? Even if it's negative and we kind of get our feelings hurt, how do we respond to it?
So I think there is such a thing as what we would refer to as constructive criticism. And one of the last questions in this lesson deals with constructive criticism. There is such a thing as constructive criticism. But this lesson primarily deals with criticism that is negative and harsh and not helpful and probably not deserved. That's primarily the kind of criticism we're talking about as a test of our faith. What do you do? How do you react when you get that kind of criticism that is tearing down rather than building up? So the first question that was asked in our study guide is, what would be the reason why some people, and we want you all to chime in here, what would be the reason why someone might offer that sort of negative, hurtful, destructive criticism? What would you think would be a reason why somebody would do that, Tom?
One, jealousy. They think that you're outshining them, whatever it wants to. Turn the tables and the spotlight from you to them.
I think that's right. I had that note on my page too, and it sort of made me think of Diotrephes in 3 John chapter 9. You know, if you look at 3 John verse 9, it says, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. So Diotrephes, he wasn't necessarily doing it himself, but he didn't want anybody else doing it either, because he wanted to have the preeminence and have the prime position. Anybody else can think of a motive that would lead someone to harsh, unfair criticism? Got anything, John?
Well, I put, similarly, I put from an enemy. Proverbs 27 and verse 6 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful." So somebody wants to kiss up to you, sort of disguise, them, maybe what they say or how they say it, because they've got a motive behind it. And so they offer some criticism or maybe even some kind of, maybe something good, but it's their motives. They got an ulterior motive.
Yeah. I have thought that sometimes people offer this kind of unfair, critical comments, maybe sort of because they feel guilty themselves that they haven't been doing more. And so they might criticize someone that they view as being active in the kingdom. They might criticize them to sort of excuse their own neglect or negligence. That might be possible. And then I also think, and I noted, that I think there are some people who are just negative in nature. There are just some people who are inclined to look at everything in a negative way. They never see anything good. They always detect only the bad. And those are the kind of people who are going to tear down and not build up. And when they criticize, they typically do it in a hateful and hurtful way. And so I think that there's some people are going to criticize because that's just their basic personality. That's what they do. All right? Go ahead, Josh.
Well, I put in my notes, sometimes people are just acting foolishly, and there's several Proverbs that talk to it. But Proverbs 16:22 says, "Understanding is a wellspring of life unto him that hath it, but the instruction of fools is folly." So sometimes there's, people providing instruction that are just acting foolishly. And so maybe they have bad motives, maybe they don't, but it's foolish instruction.
Yeah. All right, let's move on.
Okay, so question number 2 deals with John chapter 12. So if you want to turn over there to John chapter 12, we want to read the first 8 verses of John chapter 12. All right, John chapter 12, beginning at verse 1. It says, "Then Jesus, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, which had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Then saith one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, Why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and had the bag, and bare what was put therein. Then said Jesus, Let her alone, against the day of my burying hath she kept this. For the poor always ye have with you, but me ye have not always." And so the question is, considering these verses, what led to the criticism of Mary on this occasion? You think about this. So Jesus was there with them. Mary took, it says, very costly ointment and anointed Jesus. And Judas sort of came along, and Judas started saying, there's poor out here, and we could have sold this ointment and taken this money and given it to the poor. We could have done a lot of good with it, but instead you, Mary, have taken this ointment and anointed Jesus with it. And that was his criticism of her.
Which, on the surface of it, could have been a legitimate thing.
Yeah,
let's help the poor.
Yeah, it does.
It's always a good thing to help the poor.
Yep. Yeah. But the Bible tells us his motives. Right? He was greedy. He was sort of the treasurer. The King James Version says he had the bag in verse 6. And he just wanted to get his hands on some more money. He'd had an opportunity to get more money. And so, because the Bible tells us his motives, we know that he was greedy. But he provided an alternate choice. Regardless of his motives, the money could have been taken and given to the poor. And so that's what sort of his greediness led to the criticism. But it seemed to be sort of a good, reasonable criticism. And so that's the second part of the question. Did it seem reasonable? And I think it did.
On the surface.
Yeah, on the surface. But you kind of have to dig down and get toward the motives to understand where the criticism came from. So anybody got any thoughts about those verses, about that criticism coming from Judas especially?
Let's take the next part of that. Go to Matthew 26. Matthew's account of it in Matthew 26 indicates that all of the disciples joined in that same thought. This money could have been used for the poor. Matthew 26, beginning verse 6. Now when Jesus was in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, there came unto him a woman having an alabaster box of very precious ointment, and poured it on his head, and he sat at meat. But when the disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, To what purpose is this waste? For this ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor. When Jesus understood it, he said to them, Why trouble ye the woman? For she hath wrought a good work upon me. For ye have the poor always with you, but me ye have not always. So, what I thought was interesting is, we know Judas had corrupt motives in making this criticism. The other disciples also apparently offered the same criticism, but without that impure motive, for sure. Bob?
You just could have maybe instigated some of that thought to them.
Yeah. So negative Judas, corrupt Judas, got it started and they joined in. I wouldn't doubt that was the way it transpired at all. But I was thinking too, so assuming that what Bob said was probably the way it transpired, Judas, he's a greedy thief. He'd like to get more money in the treasury bag because he'd have access to it. And he said, we could have given this money to the poor. And you can almost see the other disciples saying, yeah, we could have given it to the poor. And so what Brother Hall asked us is, what should we learn regarding joining in the criticisms that others have instigated? Well, they actually look bad here, although I don't think they had the impure motives that Judas had. They look bad in joining in. And I was thinking, if at this point, they should have been fully convinced Jesus is the only begotten Son of God, to honor him in any way ought to be considered appropriate. Why are they complaining about it? But Judas got it started and they joined in.
Yeah, and maybe they didn't. Maybe it's a challenge for us because we don't know the full picture. So we hear something, that sounds right. It sounds right that should have been sold and given to the poor. And so I just jump in, I dive headfirst into that without doing any investigation. And so then I'm diving in and I'm wrongly in this case. And we know it's wrong because Jesus rebuked them and said, the poor you'll have with you always. So we sort of wrongly jump in and start attacking somebody, criticizing them, and they don't know the whole picture.
Yeah.
Tom? It's like that they were almost directing that towards Jesus. Sort of, don't you know that he was a recipient of this?
Yeah.
And they're making the sense, well, he should have known that this could have been sold to the poor. We were out here, left our homes and all this other stuff, and you just think that. But Jesus takes the opportunity to use his authority to tell them really what the purpose of it was. So that's sort of a means on combating criticism sometimes, coming back with factual information from authoritative source to combat the criticism.
Yeah, a lot of times, I think that's a good point. A lot of times the people who offer criticism don't know what they're talking about. They don't have all the information. They don't have the full picture. That happens a lot, and I think that's a really good point, Tom, and that's something we all need to be on guard about, because a lot of times someone will say something critical, and you might get caught up in that, but so often, it happens so often, that those who are critical of others in the kingdom often are doing that without the full picture of information about what's involved. Karen?
You kind of mentioned what I was thinking about saying, that I was going to use that same expression. It shows how easy it is to get caught up in something like that, similar to gossip. It reminds me, I think the two kind of go hand in hand there. It's very easy to get caught up in the criticism. It's very easy to get caught up in gossip because you want to feel like, I'm part of this, the group here. I want to be different. And so it's something to be on guard against.
Good point.
I think also, you made points too, that sometimes with elders, there's things that they know, have information of, and people are critical of them because they don't have the full information. So they voice the criticism, and it's unfounded because they don't have all the facts to go along with it.
Yeah, I know very often as elders, we're privy to some information that cannot be shared. it wouldn't be right to share it. It's, it just wouldn't be proper to expose some details of certain situations, and so people then criticize, although they don't know all the information. But that doesn't just happen to elders. I'm telling you, that can happen to us all. I know probably you have experienced that in various situations where someone wants to be critical, but they don't, to be just plainly blunt, they don't know what they're talking about. And we got to be really careful about that. Josh?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about Tom's point about Jesus was sort of indirectly criticized here because, Jesus, why didn't you stop this? I mean, she wanted to use this very expensive ointment, and you could have told her, no, we can do so much good. And so I hadn't really thought about that Jesus was kind of indirectly, even though they didn't point to him and say anything, it was kind of a shot taken at him as well, that he didn't stop it. So criticism toward Mary and toward Jesus.
Gordon?
Even in you can see what's on Jesus' mind here. Even in verse 14, he's got this scheme to go to the and portray Jesus. How much to the chief priest? How much are you willing to give for me?
So he was eat up with covetousness, greed. Yeah, absolutely. All right, go ahead, Josh.
So the next question, number 4, just asks, can you think of other Bible examples of unjust criticism? Anybody think of an example of unjust criticism? There's a lot. Go ahead, Tom.
Go right back to the beginning, the excuse when, God confronted Adam, oh, this woman that you gave me.
He basically blamed God.
He's blaming God and criticizing God. Well, if you wouldn't have given it to her, I wouldn't have had this problem. And, that sort of excuse making, sometimes excuse making is a form of criticism that isn't in itself, because you're saying, well, you weren't smart enough to know that this was going to cause me problems.
Okay, so Adam. I was thinking of Moses. Moses got tons of criticism from the children of Israel. They were griping and murmuring at him at practically every turn.
Yeah. James, do you have your hand up?
Thinking back to a similar example from the anointing, Mary and Martha, when the first introduced to them, Martha's busy with work, and she criticizes her sister for not helping. In a similar situation, they don't see the whole point of it. Jesus lets her know that that's not a valid criticism, because she's chosen the better than you to be distracted. She gave her sister an earful, or gave Jesus an earful on behalf of her sister.
Yeah.
Sister was right in the matter.
Yeah. So Martha criticizing Mary. That's a good one.
Yeah, I put several down here. The disciples of John came to Jesus on one occasion and were sort of offering some criticism about Jesus' disciples. And they said, why doesn't your disciples fast the way us and the Pharisees fast? Why does your disciples not fast? One of my, I don't know, favorite, but more well known in John 6 and verse 60, Jesus had been teaching about how he's the bread from heaven, and he had done this teaching talking about how that his followers would need to eat his flesh and drink his blood, and obviously he was talking figuratively. And in John 6 and verse 60, many therefore of his disciples, when they had heard this, said, "This is a hard saying, who can hear it?" And when Jesus knew in himself that his disciples murmured at it, he said unto them, "Doth this offend you?" As you skip down a few verses, he basically asked them, are you going to go away also? They were critical of his teaching. The things you're saying are just too hard, and people aren't going to want to listen to this stuff. And you're talking about how we got to eat your flesh and drink your blood. That's too difficult to understand. And people were turning away from him, and the disciples were critical. That's too difficult for us to hear.
Yeah.
So he was.
I think Jesus is the ultimate case of any criticism that he ever received was, by definition, unjust, unfair criticism, right? Because he was perfect. Yeah. So anytime anybody criticized Jesus, you have to believe that is the classic case of an unfair, unjust criticism. I was thinking about Matthew 12, look at Matthew 12:22. Matthew 12:22. Then was brought unto him one possessed with a devil, blind and dumb, and he healed him, insomuch that the blind and the dumb both spake and saw. And all the people were amazed and said, Is not this the Son of David? But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, This fellow doth not cast out devils, but by Beelzebub, the prince of devils. And so, here here's a case of an obvious miracle worked in their presence. This guy couldn't speak. He was what does it say? He was possessed of the devil, blind and dumb. He couldn't see and he couldn't speak. Jesus worked a miracle. He now can see and he can speak. I mean, an obvious miracle worked in their very presence, and what's the best they can come up with? He must be doing that by the power of Satan.
Yeah.
You know, they won't acknowledge a good thing when they see it.
Yeah. You know, at the beginning of chapter 12, I had in my notes where on the Sabbath day, Jesus was going through the field of corn and his disciples were hungry, and so they started plucking the ears of corn. And then the Pharisees saw that, and it just flew all over them, I guess. In verse 2, it says, the Pharisees saw it. They said unto him, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. And Jesus went on to explain to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungered, and they that were with him, he entered the house of God, he ate the showbread. So basically, they were hypercritical. They were hypocritical too. I mean, they would do some things. He went on to talk to them about some things that they would do in verses 11 and 12.
But even in that case, David, they didn't find fault with David.
No, but
he was their national hero.
Right.
But they're going to find fault with Jesus' disciples because they're going to find any fault they can.
Yeah. And maybe the Pharisees may be the ultimate example of unjust criticism all the way across the board, because they were so nitpicky at everything, trying to uphold their traditions.
I had one other. If nobody else has got another example. Oh, Bob.
I was thinking Joseph, when he had his dream of ruins.
Yeah.
Even Jacob, rebuked him for these dreams he had.
Yeah.
His decisions.
Yeah. They came true.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were prophetic dreams and they came true, but he was criticized for even having them initially. So Joseph is another. I was thinking of Daniel in Daniel chapter 6. This is the way. So here's a case of a fellow fully innocent, but when people want to, they're going to dig and dig and dig and find a reason to complain. In Daniel chapter 6, verse 4, the other presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Man, that's a pretty high bar, isn't it? When the people who hate you can't find anything bad to say about you, that's a pretty high standard that Daniel. So what'd they do? Well, they dreamed up a scheme, right? They dreamed up a scheme whereby they could get him caught in a bind between the king's law and God's law. And then they, as you remember, Daniel 6, they threw him in the lion's den. But, that I guess I would say Daniel needs to be an example for us. If people are going to criticize, and they will, make sure that we don't give them a basis for that. People will criticize, but let's don't give them any fair room to do that. Tom?
I was thinking about my blessed son, in Psalm about Absalom. He stood outside the gate and, confronted the people coming to David for judgment, and basically said, you don't have to die there. Here, let me take him.
I wish I was the king, because I would hear your case.
Yeah. And that's sort of a form of criticism that you have to. What you're doing is you're degrading the person that has the authority to do that, and saying that you can do a better job.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, there's a warning in Galatians chapter 5, verse 15. Galatians 5:15. There's a warning about this kind of thing. Now, remember, we're not talking about. There's one question here at the end of this lesson about constructive or positive criticism. We'll look at it before we're done, but we're basically talking here primarily about unfair, unjust criticism, people trying to tear down, no intention to build up. And in Galatians 5 verse 15, it says, but if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another. Have you ever felt like I'm grateful that we have loving relationships at College View, but have you ever been in a church or been in a community of Christians where you felt like there was biting and devouring taking place? Probably most of us have been at one time or another. And Paul says you better be careful, because if you bite and devour, you might end up consuming one another, completely, destroying one another. And that's what can happen. So I think there's a warning there for us. If you're inclined to engage in the kind of hurtful, hateful, harsh criticism that we're describing tonight, be careful, because you got to know it come back and bite you if you're not careful.
Yeah, I think as we get toward the end of the lesson, there's a couple of questions that drive the point home. But I was thinking about Ephesians 4, beginning of verse 31, is sort of the opposite of that. It kind of tells us how we ought to be. Ephesians 4:31 says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be ye kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." So I think there's sort of two extremes, or two sides of the coin. We can be like Galatians 5:15 says, we can be the kind of people that bite and devour one another, and then we're gonna eat each other up, is Paul's words. Or we can be the kind of people that love one another, or tenderhearted, and forgive one another. And I just say we got to be careful. I was thinking about this lesson. I was thinking about it today. Maybe I am just overcritical sometimes and unjustly critical. Because I think as we're looking at these things, we think about what's everybody else done to me? Who's been critical to me? And I need to stop and think, well, if I've been critical, if I've unjustly criticized somebody.
Yeah. I don't know how many times I've used the expression, I'm afraid that's going to come back to bite them.
Yeah.
And I really think that's what Galatians 5:15 said. Be careful. It'll come back and consume you if you're not careful. Tom?
About the First Corinthians chapter 1, Paul talking about division, and they're going through, and the Christians say, "Well, I'm Apollos, I'm a Paul, I'm a Cephas, different things. I'm a better Christian because I'm baptized. I came to the Lord like Apollos, and this one over here, that didn't really mean anything. Cephas, Peter's one taught me, and it's sort of one-upping somebody. You're sort of being critical of the one that you came from, and Paul's just telling quit worrying about that. Start looking at the unity there that we're all in Christ. Then he goes through that whole scenario. Were you baptized by Apollos, or are you baptized into my death? Did I die for you? Paul's rhetorical questions that he comes through and answers, and that's sort of the way to sort of end that criticism, is to go back to the original authority.
Get to the point. Yeah, get to the original authority point. All right.
All right, you want to move on to number 6?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so number 6 directs us to 1 Corinthians 13. So if you'll turn to 1 Corinthians 13, we'll read a few verses from there. Of course, that's the great chapter on love, pretty well known. But it says, "Consider the characteristics of love," found in 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 8. And so let's read those verses. 1 Corinthians 13, beginning at verse 4. I'm reading from the King James Version, so it says charity instead of love. "But charity suffereth long, and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail, whether there be tongues, they shall cease, whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away." And so the question asked us, considering those characteristics, list the ones that should be especially helpful in overcoming a critical attitude. Did anything in those verses stand out to you about what would be helpful in overcoming being too critical?
Well, I think the word kind there jumps off the page.
Yeah, being long-suffering and kind. I think that's so important because we often get critical when we aren't very patient with people. If I'm impatient with somebody and I think, they're not doing it the way that I think it ought to be done, well, I'm ready to just go and tell them and not be kind to them, just tell them how bad they are, in my opinion. And I think that makes us become critical. Actually, all of those things. So envieth not, love doesn't envy.
Yeah, and I looked at a newer translation on that, and it said, instead of envieth not, it says is never jealous.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, vaunteth not itself, or not being puffed up. All right, if I'm puffed up, then that may cause me to be critical. Verse 5 talks about behaving itself unseemly. Maybe newer versions say behaving rudely, seeking not our own, or being selfish. All those things, I think, as you read down through there, being easily provoked, thinking evil.
This
all of
newer
those things.
translation says quick-tempered, not
Yeah.
quick-tempered.
Yeah, all of those things, if you think about it, if I'm quick-tempered, if I'm not patient, if I am puffed up, if I'm rude, if I behave rudely, all those things are going to cause me to be critical of the people that I come in contact with. And this is in the great chapter on love. And, you know, we want to be the kind of people that love. Jesus talked about if we love one another, that's how people will know that we're followers of His. And so as we're dealing with each other, I think this will really help us in not being critical.
I love there in verse 6, Josh, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. This newer translation says, love rejoices in the truth, but not in evil. But you know, sometimes I think really critical people actually like to see something that they can latch onto, something that they think is wrong, something that they can grab hold of and be critical of. I think the kind of people we're describing here have a genuine lack of true love, and they actually rejoice in situations where they can be critical. That's a lack of love.
Well, and being selfish is tied in there too. So if I'm selfish and prideful, then I'm going to think, you know, I can do this better than everybody else. So you try to do it, but you're not as good as me. And so I will go and tell you, you know, how bad you are doing different things. So I think really at the heart of it, not having love would be selfish and prideful. And yeah, to your point, thinking evil and being happy about having something to go and criticize somebody about.
Yeah. Anybody else see anything there? Well, the Brother Hall asked, so get the point of this lesson is this is a trial of our faith. This is going to test us. How are we going to deal with unfair, undeserved, harsh criticism? How are we going to deal with that? And so he asked us, we got to pass this test. It's a major test of our faith, right? So in order to pass this test, we got to learn how to react when we are the recipients of this kind of unfair criticism. Okay? So, what do you think would be right ways to react? Understand the scenario now. Someone is coming at you and you don't deserve it. What's the right way to handle criticism of that nature? Anybody? Somebody start us off.
Just say, the Bible says, you know, we need to do this, you know, and they can see that you're trying to do right. So they can see maybe they're at fault.
Okay, so we know they're at fault, right?
Yeah.
We got to keep that in mind. You know, if you know that you are on the side of right, you got to keep that in mind. You know, I'm not going to compromise on this thing because I know what's right and what's not right. And so although I don't like being criticized about it, I'm not going to compromise in the situation because I know what's right. And so I think that's a fair point. Anybody else?
Greg, going back to 1 Corinthians 13, what love is prepared to be patient. So Christ was patient with a lot of people who got on him, and his reaction wasn't always to lash back at them. He was very patient towards them. And if we are reacting in a harsh way back to them, it's not going to solve the problem. So we have to possibly endure it if it's not appropriate criticism.
Patiently endure it. It may be necessary.
We can say, I'll consider it, and walk away.
I had the same, that word you just said, I had in my notes. We got to consider it, right? Someone makes the criticism. You can't just blow it off and ignore it. There may be some basis for it. So you got to give some consideration as to whether it might be legitimate criticism. So consider it for sure. Christy, did you have a thought?
I just think it's turning your cheek and turning the other cheek.
Okay. So if it's sort of like what James said, you know, endure it. People are going to be that way. Sometimes people are going to do that sort of thing. We're just going to have to expect it and suffer through it. I think that's right. Anybody else? Well, I had one other point there. Consider that the criticism, even if it's coming in a negative way, and then if there's any basis or fairness, if the criticism is true and right, then you got to correct the problem. Proverbs 9, verse 9, give instruction to a wise man and he will be yet wiser. Teach a just man and he will increase in learning. So, this guy who came at me has always been just mean and hateful, negative and harsh. And man, he got right up in my face about this thing. But you know, when I thought about it, I thought there was some truth to what he was saying. If that's the case, then I need to consider it and correct it.
Yeah, but I need to get past the emotional reaction and let the dust settle. And then once the dust settles, hey, that's true. So I got something needs to be corrected here. All of us are going to be lacking from time to time, and so I think we may dismiss it because that guy, he, like you said, he's always out to get me. But if it's right, then we need to correct it.
I had one thought about again the ultimate example of someone who got criticized and totally without justification was Jesus himself. 1 Peter 2:21. 1 Peter 2:21, for even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that ye should follow in his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth. Now notice, who, when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. When he was reviled, well, to be reviled would be the very kind of thing that we're talking about tonight. He just didn't turn it around. When he was reviled, he reviled not again. He didn't put it back. He could have. I try to think of that verse often when we're observing the Lord's Supper on Sunday. So everything that they were saying about him, the people who were taunting him and accusing him, spitting on him, totally disrespecting him, and he never responded in kind. When he was reviled, he reviled not again. Again, I used that expression earlier, that's a high bar. This is a high bar. Because if you say something mean and ugly to me, my inclination is I'm going to say something meaner and uglier back to you. And that's what Jesus didn't do, and that's what we can't do.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's go ahead, Josh. We're going to run out of time.
All right. So we're ready for number 8 here. What are some wrong reactions to criticism? We've kind of already been talking about some of those, but can you think of any wrong reactions to criticism? Any that you can think of, maybe a way that you've reacted to criticism before? I put down Hebrews chapter 12, and really starting at verse 11 in Hebrews 12, it says, no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. And going on down to verse 14, follow peace with all men, and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. It's kind of interesting that if I'm criticized and it's just, and my reaction is to say, I really don't like this, so I'm not going to pay any attention to that. Well, no, the Hebrew writer says no chastening, no criticism, no discipline is a joyful thing. It's not meant to be.
Nobody likes to be told they're wrong.
Right. But if I'm wrong, then I don't need to disregard it. I don't need to lash back at them, and I don't need to just say, well, I don't care what you say. I'm going to do whatever I want to anyway. If I'm wrong, I need to react in a positive way and correct it.
I thought of a verse, James chapter 1, verse 19. James 1:19. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. That's a passage I need to paste on my refrigerator door, because I've failed in this too many times. Be swift to hear. So I got to hear what this guy's saying. It's not fair. It's not just. But he's criticizing me. I got to hear that. Swift to hear, but slow to speak and slow to wrath. So don't have a hair trigger. I think that I'm guilty of that. Don't have a hair trigger. That's what this goes to, patience and long suffering that we were talking about earlier. When we get in those situations, when we feel like we've been unfairly attacked, Do not respond angrily. Do not fly off the handle in an instant, Josh. All right. We got one more here. Is there such a thing as constructive criticism? What do you think about that, anybody? Is there such a thing as... So we've been talking about negative, hurtful, unfair, unjust, undeserved criticism. That's the test of our faith, right? What about criticism that comes at us in a much more positive way, intended to help and not to tear down? First of all, when we have to give instruction, we need to be careful that we are not perceived as being, mean and hateful, harsh and overbearing. When Paul told Timothy to do the work of an evangelist, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering. Sometimes we're going to have to reprove and rebuke. And so we've got to do it in a positive way that will be helpful and not hurtful. So if we're the criticizer, the point here is try to do it in such a way that it's not hurting but actually helping. James?
Similar to the father-child relationship in Ephesians 6, verse 2, fathers aren't supposed to provoke in wrath, which we could by criticizing them unfairly, but bring them up in discipline and instruction. So teaching them the right thing doesn't, is criticism. They can say, you haven't done this right, here is the right thing to do, but it's done the right way, not provoking.
Christy?
And when Apollos was taught, or actually with Aquila and Priscilla, they explained the scriptures inaccurately. Wasn't that in there?
Yeah, I put that in my notes. I never really thought of that as criticism, but I guess, he only knew the baptism of John.
He was wrong.
Yeah, and so they pulled him aside. They taught him the full truth. And yeah, I thought the same thing.
We're just out of time. In this regard, let me read to you from Proverbs 15, verse 31. The ear that heareth the reproof of life abideth among the wise. He that refuses instruction despises his own soul, but he that heareth reproof getteth understanding. The fear of the Lord is instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. So we got to be humble enough to accept criticism and instruction when it is deserved and when it's delivered in a positive, helpful way. All right. I don't know that I would have thought of a lesson like that to start off a study on tests of our faith, but I think it's a pretty good one. We are all challenged in that regard. And so thanks for all the good comments tonight. I think there's still some study guides out there on the table. If they're not, we'll make more before Sunday. The lesson next week is how do you deal with it when you are overtaken by sin? That's the test of our faith. Some sin has gotten a hold of us. How do we handle that when we are overtaken in a sin? Thanks, everybody.